A millionaire invited a poverty-stricken boy into his home for a single night on Christmas Eve. But by dawn, the cold night air bit at Tobias's skin as he trudged through the dimly lit streets, the sounds of laughter and chatter from warm cafes and bustling shops fading behind him. At just 8 years old, Tobias had already learned more about the harshness of life than any child should. He had no home, no family, only the cruel world around him. His clothes were torn and too big for him, hanging loosely around his small frame. His shoes, if you could call them that, were barely holding together, and his feet were raw from walking endlessly through the city's unforgiving streets. Each step he took seemed to echo his loneliness. Tobias knew hunger all too well. His stomach growled, not just in need of food, but in desperation. He hadn't eaten anything in 2 days. He knew the routine by heart now: ask for food, hope for kindness. But today, as every other day, the world had nothing but indifference to offer. He approached a woman sitting on a park bench, her eyes glued to her phone. "Excuse me, miss, could you spare a little something to eat?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. His gaze stayed on the ground, avoiding her eyes, knowing what was coming. She glanced at him, her lips curling into a sneer before she turned her head away, ignoring him entirely. "Get away, kid," she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for him to hear. Tobias flinched, his heart sinking as he shuffled off, the familiar sting of rejection cutting deeper than the cold wind. The street seemed to stretch on forever, empty and cruel. Tobias's tiny hands trembled as he pushed them deep into his pockets, desperately hoping for warmth. But the wind was unforgiving, piercing through the thin fabric of his jacket. The city lights flickered above him, a dim reminder that the world went on, while he was left to fade into the shadows. He tried his best to stay out of sight, avoiding the bustling crowds and hoping no one would notice him. The last thing he needed was trouble from the authorities. Still, he couldn't stop the tears that threatened to spill as his stomach growled louder, a constant reminder of how little he had left. His feet dragged across the concrete, aching with every step, but there was no stopping now. He had nowhere to go. His gaze fell on a trash can that had been left out on the curb. Without thinking, he approached it, peering inside. The scent of stale food and garbage mixed in the air. There was a half-eaten sandwich in the corner. Tobias's heart skipped a beat, and without hesitation, he grabbed it. It wasn't much, but it was something. He unwrapped the soggy bread and shoved it into his mouth, the taste bitter but a relief nonetheless. As he ate, his thoughts wandered back to when life had been different. He could still remember his mother's voice, soft and comforting, and the warmth of their little home. But those memories had faded, buried under layers of grief and hardship. His parents were gone now, lost to a world that had no room for them, leaving Tobias to fend for himself. The streets had become his home, the cold, hard ground his bed. Every day was the same: hunger, rejection, loneliness. But somehow, Tobias had learned to survive, even if it meant pushing through the pain and the heartache. He had to survive. There was no other choice. But tonight felt different. It wasn't just the hunger gnawing at his insides. There was a weight in his chest, something deeper than the cold. It was the feeling that perhaps the world had finally given up on him. Maybe he didn't belong here. Maybe he wasn't meant to be a part of it. The soft sound of footsteps caught his attention, and he quickly wiped away the tear that had fallen from his eye. A man in a dark coat passed by, his footsteps slow and deliberate. Tobias's heart skipped a beat as he stared up at the figure. For a moment, he considered asking for help, but fear gripped him. What if this man rejected him too? What if he was just another person who saw Tobias as nothing more than a nuisance? But then, to his surprise, the man stopped. He turned around, his eyes softening as they met Tobias's. The man didn't say anything at first, just stood there, studying the boy with an expression that Tobias couldn't quite read. "Hey, kid," the man said, his voice gentle, but with an edge of concern. "You hungry?" Tobias looked up at him, wary but desperate. His heart raced. Was this real? Did this man actually care? The man took a step forward, reaching into his coat pocket. I've got some food in my bag. You can have it if you want. Tobias didn't move at first, not sure if he should trust him. But then the man smiled, a real, kind smile, and Tobias felt something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still goodness in the world. Maybe there was still a reason to keep going. The man handed Tobias a sandwich wrapped in plastic, and for the first time in a long while, Tobias felt a flicker of hope. He hesitated, then took the food from the man's hand, his fingers brushing against the warmth of it. He didn't say anything at first, just held it in his hands, feeling the weight of it like a small miracle. Thank you, Tobias finally whispered, his voice barely audible. But the man heard him, and his smile widened. You're welcome, he said. My name's John. What's yours? Tobias, the boy replied, his voice still uncertain, but there was a small spark of hope in it now. Hope that maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something different. As Tobias took his first bite of the sandwich, the warmth spreading through him, he couldn't help but think that for the first time in a long time, someone cared. Someone saw him. And that, for a boy who had spent so many nights alone and cold, was all he really needed to keep going. The streets were still cold, the world still harsh, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Tobias allowed himself to believe that kindness could exist, even in the darkest of places. And maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed to survive. The following days felt like a strange dream to Tobias. He had spent so long in the cold, invisible to everyone around him, that he almost couldn't believe someone had actually shown him kindness. John, the man who had given him the sandwich, kept his word and came back to check on him every evening. It wasn't much, just a few minutes of conversation, a little warmth, and a meal, but for Tobias, it was everything. John didn't treat him like a charity case. He didn't ask about his past or make him feel small. Instead, he spoke to him like a human being, with respect. For the first time in as long as Tobias could remember, he didn't feel invisible. And for a boy who had learned to hide in the shadows of society, that feeling was more than just comforting, it was life-changing. Are you staying out here every night? John asked one evening as they sat on a worn bench near a small cafe, the golden glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Tobias looked down at his shoes, unsure of how to answer. He had nowhere else to go, no other options. The streets were his home now. He had learned to survive by blending into the background, by not drawing attention to himself. I don't know where else to go, he said softly. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the vulnerability he rarely allowed to surface. The streets don't have any other place for me. John's face softened as he listened. There was something in his eyes, concern, sympathy, but also determination. He placed a hand on Tobias's shoulder, an unexpected gesture of comfort that made Tobias look up. Listen, Tobias, John said, his voice gentle but firm, you don't have to be out here by yourself. There's a place I know. It's not much, but it's safe. It's a little shelter for kids like you who've fallen through the cracks. You don't have to keep fighting this alone. Tobias's heart fluttered in his chest, a mixture of hope and fear racing through him. It sounded too good to be true. He had heard about shelters before, but they always felt like promises that never lasted. And yet, something about John's words felt different. John had already proven that he cared. He had shown Tobias that not everyone would turn their back on him. Maybe this place could be the beginning of something better. I'll think about it, Tobias replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't want to get his hopes up too high, only to have them dashed again. But something inside him urged him to take a chance. What did he have to lose? For the next few days, John continued to visit him, bringing food, a blanket when the nights grew colder, and a steady presence in the chaos of Tobias's life. And with each passing moment, Tobias began to feel like maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Maybe the world didn't have to be so cruel after all. But then, one afternoon, everything changed. Tobias was walking down the street, his stomach growling as usual, when he saw something that made his heart sink into his chest. A group of men, dressed in dark suits, were standing outside a building, talking and laughing. Tobias tried to keep his head down, but one of them spotted him. A cold, mocking smile spread across the man's face as he turned to his friends. Well, what do we have here? A little street rat?" the man sneered. Tobias froze. His heart hammered in his chest, and a cold wave of panic rushed over him. He was used to being ignored, to being invisible. But this was different. The man's voice was full of disdain, like Tobias was nothing more than an annoyance to be ridiculed. Before Tobias could move, the man stepped forward and grabbed him by the arm, yanking him roughly toward the building. "Where do you think you're going, huh? You don't belong here. People like you don't belong anywhere." Tobias's eyes widened, the grip on his arm tightening as the other men laughed. He struggled to pull away, but the man's hold was too strong. His mind raced, his heart pounding in his ears. How had it come to this? What had he done wrong? Why was he always the one who had to suffer? Just as he was about to break free, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Hey! Let him go." John appeared, rushing toward the scene with a look of fierce determination on his face. Without hesitation, he stepped between Tobias and the men, his body blocking the group from getting any closer. His eyes were steely, unwavering. "I said, let him go," John repeated, his voice low and steady. The men paused, a flicker of hesitation passing between them. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not from someone like John. But John didn't back down. "This boy has done nothing to you. You don't get to treat him like this." For a moment, the men exchanged glances, sizing John up. Then, with a grunt of frustration, the one who had grabbed Tobias released his hold, shoving Tobias back with a final sneer. "You're lucky, old man," the man spat before turning and walking away with his friends. John stood there for a moment, his back still facing Tobias. He didn't look at the boy right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. The adrenaline from the confrontation still coursed through him, but he was determined not to show weakness. Not in front of Tobias. Finally, he turned to face the boy, who stood there, shaking, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "You all right?" John asked, his voice softening. Tobias nodded, though the tears that had been threatening to fall were now a flood. He wanted to thank John, to express his gratitude, but words failed him. How could he explain the rush of emotions he was feeling? How could he describe the overwhelming sense of relief that had washed over him, knowing that someone was there to protect him? John gently placed a hand on Tobias's shoulder, squeezing it in reassurance. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said, his voice steady, his eyes warm. "I'm here. I'll always be here." And in that moment, Tobias finally allowed himself to believe in something he hadn't thought possible for so long: safety, care, friendship. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone in this world. And that, more than anything, was enough to give him the courage to take the next step. The days following the encounter with the men outside the building felt strangely quiet, as though a fragile peace had settled over the world. Tobias continued to see John every evening, and with each visit, the bond between them grew stronger. John's words, the promise that he would always be there, became a lifeline Tobias clung to. The cold nights seemed a little less harsh, the hunger a little less gnawing, and for the first time in his life, Tobias felt like he had someone who cared for him. But as the days turned into weeks, Tobias started to notice something different in John. His once steady steps became slower, and his usually warm smile seemed to fade at times, replaced by a quiet sadness. Tobias didn't know what it was, but he felt the change in the air. John had always been so strong, his unwavering confidence, his quiet courage, but now, there was a hint of weariness in his eyes that Tobias couldn't ignore. It was a chilly Thursday evening when it happened. Tobias had just finished his chores around the street, trying to make a little extra money by helping a kind old man with his grocery cart, when he spotted John sitting at their usual spot, a small bench by the corner cafe. But today, John wasn't smiling. His head was lowered, and he was clutching his chest, his breath shallow and labored. "Tobias," he whispered as Tobias rushed over, his voice strained. I'm just tired." Tobias knelt beside him, his heart sinking. Something was terribly wrong. "John, what's happening? What's wrong?" John smiled weakly, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm just getting old, kid. My heart, it's just giving out." His voice cracked, and Tobias could see the sweat glistening on his forehead, the labored rise and fall of his chest. Without thinking, Tobias stood up and started to shout for help, but John reached out and grabbed his wrist, pulling him back down. "No," John said softly, "don't waste your energy. I'm too far gone." He let out a small, bitter laugh, one that didn't sound like him at all. "But you'll be fine. You'll make it." Tears sprang to Tobias's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He had been through so much in his short life, but this, losing John, the one person who had shown him true kindness, was a pain deeper than anything he had ever known. "I'm not going to leave you," Tobias said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going to leave you, John. Please, don't leave me." John smiled, though it was faint. "You've always had it in you, kid. I knew it from the moment I saw you. You're stronger than you know. You don't need me. You never did." And with those words, John's eyes closed, and his body went still. Tobias felt as if the world had come to a screeching halt. His heart felt as though it had shattered into 1,000 pieces, the loss unbearable. The man who had taken him in, who had shown him love when no one else would, was gone. The world, which had seemed so much brighter since he had met John, now felt cold and empty again. For a long time, Tobias couldn't move. He just sat there, numb, beside John's lifeless body. He had lost the one person who had shown him what it meant to be truly cared for. But as the minutes passed, and the reality of what had happened began to settle in, Tobias realized something that gave him a little solace: John had given him something priceless. He had given him hope, and more than that, he had shown Tobias what kindness really meant. The tears that had been threatening to fall now streamed down Tobias's face, but this time, they weren't just tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. Gratitude for the time he had with John, for the lessons John had taught him about compassion, about standing up for others, about being strong even when life seemed to be falling apart. He had learned what it meant to help others, not out of obligation, but because it was the right thing to do. And that, in itself, was a gift that would live on in Tobias's heart forever. When the authorities came, they took John's body away, and Tobias was left standing in the same spot, still clutching the small, crumpled note that John had written to him just a few days before. It was a simple note, but it carried more weight than anything Tobias had ever read. "Keep going, Tobias. There's a better world out there for you. Don't ever stop believing in it. Don't ever stop believing in yourself." Tobias wiped his eyes, taking a deep breath. John's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. He had to keep going, just like John had always said. John's death left a hole in Tobias's heart, but it also sparked a fire within him, a determination that would not be extinguished. He would carry John's lessons with him forever, and he would find a way to make sure that his kindness, his love, lived on. As the weeks passed, Tobias found a small job at a local market. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. He no longer wandered the streets in search of food or shelter. He had learned to take care of himself, to rely on the lessons John had instilled in him. And in the quiet moments, when the world felt too heavy, Tobias would look up at the sky and think of his friend. He would always remember John, not just for the help he had given him, but for the heart he had shared, for the quiet moments of compassion, for the way he had changed Tobias's life forever. And so, Tobias carried on. And in doing so, he honored the man who had taught him that even in the darkest moments, there was always hope.